In this video, we continue our study of Jesus' messages to the seven churches in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. And we pick up on the fourth message of Jesus to the church in the city of Thyatira in Revelation 2, verse 18 through 29. This is by far the longest of Jesus' messages. We don't really know much about the church in Thyatira, other than, interestingly, Lydia, Paul's first convert in the city of Philippi in Acts chapter 16, came from Thyatira. But Jesus introduces himself in verse 18. He says, "The words of the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire, and whose feet are like burnished bronze." The main deity of the city of Thyatira was Apollo. Apollo was the son of Zeus, often referred to as the Son of God. So it's interesting that Jesus says, "I am the true Son of God," not Apollo. And the eyes like a flame of fire, the feet of bronze refined in a furnace, refer back to John's vision of Jesus in chapter 1, and these are both images of judgment. And as we'll see in a moment, a major part of Jesus' message here to this church is a warning of judgment. But first, in verse 19, Jesus praises the church for their many good works. He says, "I know your works, your love, your faith and service and patient endurance, and that your latter works exceed the first." So there was a lot of good things going on in this church. Jesus says, you're a loving church, you're faithful, you're serving your community, you're enduring in the faith, and you're doing this more now than you were in the beginning. But the church in Thyatira had a big problem. In verse 20 he says, "But I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols." Now, what is Jesus talking about here? Well, first of all, Jezebel was the wife of King Ahab, who is often referred to as the most wicked king of Israel, and in large part due to Jezebel, who led him, and therefore the entire nation, into deep idolatry and wickedness. And it seems that there was a woman in the church in Thyatira who was also leading many of the Christians in the church to practice idolatry, eating food sacrificed to idols. Sexual immorality can refer here to literal, sexual immorality, sexual sin, but probably refers mainly to spiritual adultery, idolatry, worshiping idols. And I think what Jesus is probably referring to here is the pagan feasts and festivals that were celebrated in Thyatira and throughout the ancient Roman Empire. It seems that there was a woman in the church who was telling the Christians that, you know what, it's okay for you to go to church on Sunday and then go and participate in these pagan feasts and festivals where they offer sacrifices. The food and the drink is sacrificed to the gods and they eat of it. It's okay to do all that. It's fine. And Jesus is saying, nope, it's not okay. It's not fine. And so we see that the theme here is like in Pergamum, that Jesus does not tolerate compromise. He doesn't want you to have one foot in the church and one foot in the world. As he said in the Sermon on the Mount, you cannot serve both God and mammon. Choose this day whom you will serve, Jesus says. And you might think to yourself, well, why were these Christians participating in these pagan feasts and festivals? Why didn't they just stay home? And it's interesting that in those days, if you were a craftsman, you probably belonged to a guild, a trade guild. And part of this trade guild was many feasts and festivals that the guild would host in honor of various gods and goddesses. And so just as at your work you're invited to various work parties, maybe a Christmas party, in those days you would go to a work party, so to speak, and at that work party people would worship idols. And so it was normal, it was natural, and yet Jesus says, no, I don't want you to compromise in this way. And so for the Christians, there was a cost involved in following Jesus. They could lose friends, they could lose business, they could lose their job altogether. And yet Jesus is calling them to faithfulness, to follow after him. And, you know, I don't know if you have suffered consequences, costs for following Christ. We know that there are many of our brothers and sisters around the world who have suffered much for their decision to follow Christ. And yet for them, it was worth it. And I believe that for us as well, it's also worth it to search our hearts and search our minds. If you look at verse 23, Jesus says, I am he who searches mind and heart, and I will give to each of you according to your works. This reminds me of David's prayer in Psalm 139, where he says, O Lord, search me and know me. Search my heart, try my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me. That's a good prayer to pray, isn't it? Lord, search me and know me. Reveal any compromise in my heart, in my mind, in my life. Lord, I want to serve you with all of my heart. I want to serve you with all of my mind. There is a cost involved to following Jesus, and yet the reward of belonging to him, the reward of eternal life, is well worth any cost. Thank you for watching, and tune in with us next time as we conclude our study of Jesus' message to the church in Thyatira.